Hello again, everyone. So I want to sort of reflect on what's changed in the procurement world over the past few years, and especially in my lifetime. There's sort of 3 decades of doing this kind of thing, and I see really big and profound changes in this space compared to what I grew up with, and probably many of you are familiar with, which is what I would characterize as a time cost quality paradigm. You know, I've had a number of conversations. I can think of one particular procurement director who pretty much used to say, you know, are you in my office to help me with time, cost, and quality? And if not, why are you still in my office? And that was the basic conversation that we were having all the time. And if I dared to stay in his office, he'd say, well, have you brought me money? Have you brought me some money because you're bringing me a whole load of problems around sustainability and someone needs to pay for it. So how much are you prepared to pay to add sustainability to my list of criteria against which we will be procuring things? And I've always found this conversation a little bit frustrating because there's no easy way out of it. I never had any money, and I always felt that the issues we were talking about were bigger than time, cost, and quality. So over the past decade and a half, I kind of been exploring that space and trying to make sense of it. So what follows is my effort at that, and I'll be interested to hear your efforts and thoughts and whether you feel this is a valid perspective. But things have changed, and as you all know from just watching the news, if you're not any closer than that, yeah, climate is there. Climate is a major issue, and now needs to be taken into consideration with everything we do in our lifestyles, especially if we're procuring goods. The climate and nature is following quickly behind climate as an issue. We need to think about the impacts of our industrial systems and our consumer behavior on nature. And on top of that, you have provenance. You know, where did things come from, and what were the conditions like along the supply chain from wherever your raw materials and parts came from? What were the working conditions like, especially at the far end of the supply chain? What were the geopolitics like? And that's especially relevant as we speak. And all those things that have come out in the past couple of years around COVID and around, you know, supply chain, for me, has become, it used to be just for those of us that were in that space, but, you know, everybody's talking about supply chains now. It's become this common phrase because people have been exposed to what a supply chain is through COVID and all the many repercussions and implications of complex logistics, disruption of supply, additional costs and time in logistics, and a general sense of volatility and reliability in supply chains. So all of this is arriving at once and expands our frame of reference beyond a basic time, cost, quality view of the world. And so we find ourselves now, you know, somewhat reactively looking at what are the risks and dependencies in the supply chain. You know, how does it really work? And you get into a complex analytical thing, either reactively to crisis, as we've seen with COVID, or more proactively, as the sustainability discipline suggests we should have been doing all along. And what we've seen as a result of all of this is a shift away from what I grew up with when I started in the automotive industry 3 decades ago, which was a focus on performance efficiency and just-in-time delivery, and taking out all the surplus stock, all of the surplus material waste, and just being really efficient at delivering one thing at least cost, at maximum speed and highest quality. And we see, yeah, rather than making that the main sort of goal of goodness of a supply chain, we're shifting towards thinking more about resilience. You know, not just have we achieved highest quality at least cost and on time, but are we even going to get the stuff? You know, is it going to arrive? Are we sure it's going to arrive? And what are the risks en route? And so, and this isn't irrational. There's nothing wrong with this. We've lived through comparatively stable times, and in stable times you take a process and then you optimize it and optimize it more and optimize it more, and because it's stable, you know that you'll face pretty much the same conditions tomorrow as you did today, so you can change it around, take out any waste. You can take out risk mitigations because you know things will be more or less the same, so you don't have to mitigate against lots of changes. When you move into the space we're now in, where we're seeing ever increasing volatility, having no mitigation, having no stock and so forth, it starts to become a foolhardy thing. We've seen the implications of that. So we shift towards a resilience model rather than an efficiency model, and you end up moving away from just in time into a just in case model, where you say, are we able to continue supply here, rather than have we absolutely cost optimized what we're doing. And that does have cost implications, because the just-in-time paradigm worked because it squeezed out all waste, and it achieved global supply chains which were reliable and efficient, and therefore cheap. And what we're seeing now is the need to put in some of the fat gains there, to say build up stocks and have maybe multiple routes, multiple suppliers where we might have had only one or two, in order to be sure of supply. And this drives up costs. There is a fundamental inflationary pressure to that kind of process, which we engineered out over the past 3 or 4 decades. So there's a kind of logistical element to that and a material flow element to that, which is one aspect. There's then another aspect, which is around stakeholders. So, and again, the world I've grown up in and was educated in had a fairly narrow definition of stakeholders. Typically, you look at your customers, you look at your employees, you look at your suppliers, and you look at your shareholders. And when I trained as an accountant in my second main career, we were taught, it's shareholders, because if you're satisfying the shareholders, you must have satisfied the customers and employees and suppliers somewhere. So shareholders are the main stakeholder, and that's all been shaken up as well, in that you now are encouraged to take more care of directly of your customers, your employees and suppliers. But that whole stakeholder field has expanded much, much more. So there's this expectation to know more about your supply chain, not just your tier 1 supply chain, but as I was saying, around issues such as provenance. Where did the things that you're using in shipping come from? And do you understand where they came from and what happened to them en route? So you need to not just look at your tier 1 supplier, but have some understanding of the whole supply chain, both for provenance, but again, for reporting reasons, things like a carbon footprint and things like that. So there's the stakeholders along your supply chain. There's increasing regulatory pressure in this space, so you need to have an understanding of your government. And again, if you have a multinational or global supply chain, it's going to be multiple governments, and that can get very complicated very quickly. There's then non-government organizations, and they come generally in 2 flavors. There's the friendly ones who are there to help you think about these issues and to collaborate and find solutions, and the slightly more aggressive ones who are often there to shine a light on what you're doing. Did you know where this stuff came from? Did you know there was child labor in this supply chain? Did you know that there was deforestation here, and so on? So there's those kinds of organizations that may shine a light on something that you're doing or that you're indirectly involved with, that reflect on your brand, and the media performing the same kind of role, shining a light on various issues which may have been raised by a whole other group of stakeholders, which are those that are affected by the externalities of your behaviors. Things that if you're creating air pollution, people near your factories, if you're acquiring wood from a certain part of the world, you might be deforesting, whatever, not directly, but through your supply chain. So there are people who are affected by those externalities, and then they can get together with the media or non-government organizations or the government and campaign against your activities. So you have to think about all of these people and the implications for them of your activities directly and indirectly. And I mentioned shareholders, but I mean, again, that whole area is becoming more complicated as well. So whereas shareholders were fairly clear, you were trying to maximize shareholder return, we're seeing now the whole financial sector becoming driven more towards this. They're doing so-called ESG measures and so forth, so environmental, social, and government impacts are being measured. And there are increasing mandates to look at things like carbon footprints and impacts on nature, to report on that, and eventually to be governed and regulated on that. So that then starts to spill over into areas where this may not have been an issue, such as loan capital, where if you can afford to repay it, you probably get the loan. There are now strings being attached to those kinds of financial instruments to say, well, can you repay it, and does it have a low carbon footprint? Does it have negative impacts on nature? So the whole financial sector is becoming more complicated than just providing healthy, regular shareholder returns to shareholders, and you're looking at a much more complicated landscape of stakeholders across the financial community. So the answer here is to do lots of mapping, understanding the stakeholders. Who are they? Where are they? What are their interests? So so you look back at what I've said so far and you think, well, this seems like an awful lot of effort and it seems like it's really complicated. And you're right, it is an awful lot of effort and it is really complicated, which then gets me to the next issue that I see in this space, which is that of collaboration. So given that everybody's moving this direction, you can share the expense and the risks and the benefits of actually doing these things. So you may be collaborating with people then that you may not normally collaborate with, in order to find this information. You know, if you're looking at a supply chain, you're saying, well, we don't want there to be child labour in the supply chain. Should we invest in finding that out and assuring it all along the supply chain as a business, or actually does everybody in this sector want that? You know, and if all of your competitors want that, and it's not something which is going to give you competitive advantage to have it, then why not collaborate with your competitors to create, you know, a child labour-free supply chain? And it doesn't have to be about that issue. I use that as a simple example. So you could end up collaborating with people, including your competitors here. So there's then the nuance of saying, well, when do you collaborate? You're not going to collaborate on everything. We need competition. I mean, even the organizations that do collaborate on this, the first thing you have to do to form an organization, that is to sign to say it's not an anti-competitive cartel that you're forming. So you have to remain competitive with your competitors, but there may be things you want to collaborate on. So having a good sense of where to decide how to collaborate and when to collaborate, when to compete, when to not necessarily compete in isolation, but just to be a first mover. You know, I've done work on things like, you know, coming up with new, more sustainable materials, and then having the option to patent that, saying, well, no, I actually want everybody to use this, but we will just move first into it and we'll be the first adopter, and then let everybody use that material to make it the new normal, but we will take the competitive kudos of being the first mover in that space, rather than being the only people with access to a sustainable material. So there's this spectrum of competition, collaboration, what is distinctive and what is going to give you a unique selling point versus what is actually the kind of price of entry thing that you might want to share costs and obligations and analysis with others, including your competitors. Which then leaves you with a complex decision around, well, who and how do you collaborate? Who do you go to collaborate? And there are a whole series of options around that. You can collaborate along your supply chain. I've done that, where you go to your supplier and your supplier's supplier, and you go along that and say, well, let's everybody get to understand each other. Let's find a way of getting into a room and saying, well, where does this material come from, and what are the implications, and what do we need to share between us? You might choose an industry association. If you have a healthy industry association in your industry where people get together and talk about things in general, you can talk about these kinds of topics. You might want to build a purpose-built multi-stakeholder organization that looks at these topics. So you've got stewardship initiatives and you've got responsible sourcing initiatives and things like this, where there's lots of those in industrial materials, there's lots in agriculture and food and fisheries and so forth. So those organizations may be built specifically to address these issues and to establish standards, ways of communicating, say performance standards that say this is what good looks like, and everybody inside this club has to conform with that, and chain of custody standards that say, oh, this is how we do the tracing of these materials along supply chains. So there's a whole series of vehicles there that you can use to do collaboration, and as I say, therefore share the costs and the complexities of these additional burdens, as you might see it, on a procurement process. And then it comes to the final one in this space for me, which is one, again, I've used quite a number of times, which is actually using training. And I've actually used training to get people from along the supply chain, especially things like circular economy, where you need material to flow round and round, get people who are a microcosm of the supply chain in a room. You go through a training program with them, but you also weave into that collaboration where they actually communicate with each other, understand each other's perspectives, create more empathy and more solutions. And through that kind of process, you can help, again, reduce the cost of these additional burdens of information sharing by doing innovation. You know, what often there are huge quantities of waste in an industry. Certainly there was in automotive. When I was in automotive, you see it in food, you see it in energy. When you actually look at the whole system, it's full of waste. And when you talk to people all the way along the supply chain, you can eliminate that waste and make really big strides towards performance improvement. And in that sense, really, the heart of this is systems change, rather than the kind of transactional change that we might be seduced into as we go through various crises and this volatility I was talking about, where you say, okay, this problem's come up, okay, fix that. This problem's got to fix that. You step back and say, well, actually, these problems are actually systemic, and therefore the solution is systemic. You know, Einstein said we won't fix today's problems using the same level as thinking that we use to get ourselves into that space. And this is like that. If we have a broken system, we need to redesign the system, which means getting people who participate in the system in a room and thinking creatively about what good really looks like at the level of system design. So that's throwing the net wider, but the solutions are so much more powerful in that situation and so much more permanent. And that's how you kind of deal with complexity and volatility. And you start to see things align. You know, you see that now. The geopolitics of what's playing out at the moment. So actually, if we'd had renewable energy and weren't dependent upon oil and gas being shipped around the world, that would have, you know, made some of the discussions we're having at the moment a bit easier, might have created a bit more peace. So that sort of falls out, and it might have been a bit cheaper to make the transition. The things tend to come, you know, sort of the solutions tend to come as a pack around any particular area. So coming back to the main topic here, how does this relate to education? Well, we didn't prepare for this. You know, certainly the education I was put through was totally inappropriate for the level of challenge that we now face. And depending on how recently you're educated, you may find the same thing to some degree. And so we need to rethink and re-educate, and we need to come up with new skills, new processes, new metrics, and new relationships to deal with these kinds of issues, and to be able to make complex decisions around things like supply chain design, and relationship management. And the good thing about the education side, and again, a thing that I spend a long time sort of cataloging for myself, are whatever you do, you won't be the first to do it. You know, so you may be the first in your sector, but part of the education process for me is creating case studies that say, you want a chain of custody thing. Well, they've done this in this sector. Why don't you see if you can adapt that to your sector? So that there are proven solutions out there, and the more we educate, the more we collaborate, the more we produce case studies, the more we can share that, and the quicker we can bring valid, working, complex solutions to bear across multiple sectors. So yeah, you can learn by those examples that are already there, and you can de-risk your efforts and not take quite so many leaps of faith and not have to reinvent or sort of invent things from scratch so often. And the other thing, as I mentioned a little earlier, I said, you know, I've taken whole supply chains away on an education program. If you can do an education program with colleagues from your organization, that means you build a common understanding and a common language. And if you're trying to change things, you don't have to explain it over and over again to each colleague. If you can do that with your suppliers or along a supply chain, that means the same thing happens, but at a next order of magnitude up. You're dealing with lots of people in lots of organizations that have a common understanding. And if they've worked with you on a collaborative education program, you may have come up with some solutions you can actually implement. And I've also collaborated with customers, you know, on an education program to, you know, how to do smart buying and buy sustainable solutions from the point of view specifying what needs buying. So the education thing comes as the other side of the collaboration coin there. If you can do it collectively, and even if you can't, it helps you digest this and bring your colleagues along with you within your organization and along supply chains. And because of the level of complexity and the level of change that we face, for me, education is an absolute necessity to all these other changes, because we're just not prepared for it using our traditional paradigms, our traditional ways of thinking, and we really run the risk of repeating the same mistakes over and making transactional quick fixes and not system solutions that can address the full plethora of the complexity of what we face in terms of the levels of change that we see that I mentioned in my introduction. So I think that's my time up. So I'll hand.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that the chat is bursting with questions. But I mean, in summary, what you're saying is the way we've been looking at education in procurement so far, you know, no longer is relevant. We need to change. It needs to change, and we see different institutions starting to look at it differently. I mean, CISL. But Duncan, what is your view on this? I mean, SIPs, what are you guys? What are you doing on to address this challenge? Because basically we're asking procurement people now not to be looking at costs, but to develop a whole new series of skills and competencies. And do you think that procurement professionals at the moment are adequately equipped to carry those changes?
I think it's a really interesting shift that Ian's just talked about there, because I totally agree that there is a different skill set. But what's really interesting, we just spent some time at SIPS looking at, I suppose, the end-to-end procurement cycle and looking at all the aspects of sustainability that's needed all the way through and what skills you need. And in some cases, the skills are there already, but maybe the lens you look through is different. So let's take, I don't know, decision making when you're evaluating a supplier's proposals. We know how to do balanced decision making because that's what we've been taught to do. It's where you build in the sustainability element into that, and how you build that, and how you make sure your stakeholders you're working with fully understand why that's an important evaluation. It's a modification of the skills, but I think in other spaces there is absolutely a need to build up a lot more skills and knowledge, and we're getting asked all the time now, how do I do this? How do I mean, Ian touched on some of them. How do I measure this? How do I track carbon? How do I work with my suppliers to change things differently? But we've been doing supply development for years. We've been working, I mean, Ian in automotive, and I worked at it for Black & Decker. We worked with supply development initiatives. We drove supplier improvements on quality and efficiency. So we can do the same. So the skills are there. What we find, though, is to be really good at working with your suppliers, you need to understand the topic. You need to understand what those elements are that you can influence and change in your supply chain. And then you need to work with your suppliers to drive those improvements forward. So there are skills that need to change. We as SIPS are constantly looking at how we improve and change those skills. But we've been asked at all levels. We've been asked at those very basic levels of what is this thing I'm supposed to change, all the way up to those very sophisticated value chain improvements that I need to drive forward. I think what we are seeing, though, is an absolute significant increase in people wanting to do more in the space, which is great, but I'm wanting to invest in education in a way that I don't think I've seen before. I've seen lots of people talking about wanting to do things. I haven't seen many people actually putting the funding in to make the changes and to invest in their skills and their capability. And I think that has been driven, as Ian touched on a bit earlier, by the current fragility in our supply chains. And people know that they need to improve how they manage their supply chains and make them more resilient, and can make them shorter, make them more effective, make them more resilient as we go through. So I think there's a lot of change needed there. I think the other thing I'll just touch on is collaboration. Ian touched on it. It's easy to say collaborate, but it's a really, really difficult thing to do. You've really got to navigate your way through those competitive environments, but collaboration can work really well. And one good example I've seen is in the construction sector in the UK, where the certain big contractors got together and said, we need to improve sustainability in construction down through our supply chain. A lot of SMEs working in there, a lot who needed support and education. And they built the supply chain sustainability school. They invested in it. They got it available as free for the SMEs. And those SMEs then started to really learn about all the elements of sustainability and how they could impact them and influence them. That, I think, is a great example of true collaboration on a topic of interest where they could all do it themselves, but coming together drove an education program down through the supply chain. And I'm seeing other groups now that we work with and our networks wanting to do exactly the same. They know they can't just do it themselves. Where do they come together to drive and educate both their procurement organizations themselves, but then their supply chains? So you won't get this through without improving your supply chains as well. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot more to do. But actually, as I said, it's very encouraging. We're starting to see some real investments in this from everybody. And the fact that, like today, people are investing in learning from each other, learning the case studies, learning the examples, looking at the awards, looking at who's won awards in this space. How can you take that skill set and take it forward? So I see there's a lot to change, but I see there's a lot more still to be done in this space.
And I think one question is also, if I'm put myself in the shoes of maybe someone in the audience, think, okay, I want to do something, I want to learn more, I want to educate myself about sustainable procurement and supply chain. The offer is huge. I mean, where do I start? How do I know what is relevant, what is good for me? I mean, you can do a short course. Listening to our conferences today is also one way to train yourself. Bringing awareness, to going through a full swing PhD. So, what is the offer out there? And I'm not asking necessarily to put names on institutions, but how do I choose what is relevant for me?
I think my answer would be, what's the topic that is most relevant to your organization that you need to start on? And if that's, because that's your starting point, isn't it? You can go off and learn everything, but you need to be driven by the organization you work with. Are they really focused on one aspect of this? And then learn those skills. As you said, there's articles, there's case studies, there's examples all over the space. There's short training courses, there's long involved training courses. I think you need to start. I think for everyone, I would just say, start somewhere, build up some skills, and then you'll get more and more curious, and you'll start to understand more and more, and start to look at, do you need those sophisticated skills, or actually in your organization, do you need to know enough to be able to start to drive some initiatives and some agendas forward? So you're right. I mean, we could sit here and list hundreds of courses, and we've all got them. But I think you as a person need to choose which ones are really relevant to your role and to your organization, and then build up your skills and your knowledge on those and get started.
What's your view on that, Ian?
Yeah, well, I agree with Duncan. It's where you're at. I mean, certainly at an individual level, you can start small, these kinds of things, raising your own awareness. We set up our online course, which is an 8-week course, part-time, quite affordable, which gives you, a good grounding in these things. What we often find is people do want more than that, but once you've started, what you want, where you want to go next. So we have a kind of graduated offer from online to part-time, residential and so forth. So I think you can find your own way in it, but I think Duncan said, get started. You start at where you're at, start with something affordable. If your organisation supports it, then go as big as they can support. I can honestly say I've done lots of this with individuals, with organisations, with supply chains. I don't remember a situation where people came away saying, "Oh, it's a complete waste of money." Didn't learn anything. It was nothing. Wasn't worth the time and money on that. I mean, even when I very first started doing this, I always got a remark which has stuck with me forever as the kind of benchmark. Somebody said, "I went on your 1-day course for sustainable procurement. I thought it was going to be the dullest day of my life, but it's actually one of the most interesting." So I've always aspired to repeat that. But I mean, it isn't. You are solving problems, for your job, but you're actually solving problems for humanity as well. There's a reward to that. So, I can make sense of this now. I can contribute to something which is actually worthwhile. So I get started at whatever level you can afford, and as big as you can afford. Certainly start at a personal level if there are no other options. But if you can get your organisation involved, often these things do. Somebody gets a bit of an education and they become an evangelist and a champion for it, and then it kind of spreads organically. And I've seen that happen again and again, where somebody does a course, thinks, "Well, everybody needs to do this," and I saw one in the chat say, "Everybody should do this." It has that effect. You get some exposure to it. You think, if more people knew this, we could be more successful. So it kind of ripples through. So if you do it, or if you can get somebody more senior than you to do something like that as well, and then get a department doing it, an organization doing it, a supply chain doing it, it does tend to spread. And that's a kind of natural phenomenon, because you do need to do it collaboratively, and there's no point in having just a champion. It needs to be some as a common understanding across a community of people.
I'd like to ask Stephanie, invite you to join the conversation as well. Maybe it would be good to hear from your own story and experience, because you're one of those procurement professionals who at some point decided to go into the sustainability journey. So how did that happen for you? What was the trigger, and what did you decide to do, and where did it bring you?
Yeah, so in more recent years, I have been interested in sustainability a lot, but I actually didn't really have much knowledge about it before. And looking back to my early career, kind of around 2005, it was interesting that sustainability was never ever something that was mentioned. And the main objective was to develop and purchase products on time and at the right price, given the highest margin possible. And yeah, looking back as an example, there's one company I worked for where we'd often ship product from the Far East, and it would always be sent by sea. But if it's going to miss a product launch, they wouldn't think twice about just airing everything. And that's things like that I found, looking back, really surprising, that no one ever questioned it. And now it's really much more of kind of fundamental and everyday thinking, just from doing the course that I did recently. So as I was saying, I had an interest in sustainability, and I completed a 9-month course at CISL in sustainability and business, which specialised in value chains. And the good thing about the course was that it was over a 9-month period. There were lots of different stages involved, and I found that it was really good for me because it was a good amount of time. And I would have loved to have carried on. It was a third of a master's, and you can carry on and do a further 2 years. But at this moment in time, I have a young family, and I couldn't continue it. But I did feel that 9 months gave me such an amazing grounding. And I feel like the journey's kind of just beginning, which is really exciting. One of the things that I found when I started the course was I was just completely blown away by the scientific material that was out there and the huge impact that humans are having on the planet. And I just couldn't believe that a lot of that information isn't in the public domain, and that you have to really look deeper into the subject to really find a lot of the information. But I soon realized that there are things that we can do, and that instead of feeling defeated by it, I actually felt really excited and energized, and I was looking at what I could do at work and even at home as well in my own personal life to really make a difference. That collaborative thing that everyone mentioned about, if we all do a little bit collaboratively, it does actually make a big difference. And instead of kind of shying away from it and thinking it's this huge big mountain to climb, if we sort of break it down into small pieces, there is actually a lot that you can do. And then you start to see these changes and the positive outcomes that come from them, which is really rewarding. Yeah, also going back to looking back at my earlier career, I didn't actually think I was working in such a sustainable way, but having done the course, it was interesting that to look back, and actually I was doing quite a lot of things naturally that were actually sustainable. So sustainability is not just about the environmental impact, it's actually about the social impact as well. And I've always made sure that my relationships with my suppliers have always been good, and I've really worked on that, and I've always been really passionate that anyone working together for us in the value chain is paid fairly and treated well. So that was quite nice to have that confirmation that actually I was doing some parts of it well.
You're on the right path already.
Yeah, exactly. So there were some things, so that was good. Yeah, and I think every day I see that some things I'm doing in the right direction, and it's also highlighted areas where there are definite improvements that need to be made. But as I was saying, it's kind of breaking it down and doing it bit by bit rather than feeling overwhelmed. Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of information out there as well that I found from doing the course. So when I wrote some papers for the course, and I had to do a lot of research, and a lot of big companies like Apple and Stella McCartney, another clothing brand, Houdini, they actually have a lot of sustainability reports and frameworks just on their websites, which is free information, so you can go and have a look there. I found that really interesting. A lot of information is actually out there, but it's not until you're in the environment and people kind of are in the space telling you about where these things are that you can find. I found that really beneficial as well and inspiring. So I'm gonna have a little drink of water if that's okay.
Yeah, that's sure. Well, Khaled's been telling me these questions. We need to answer the questions. So Khaled, over to you. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your experience. And please, any of the three of you can answer the questions. The floor is yours, Khaled, with the questions, because you've been keeping a sharp eye on that.
Sure. Yeah, I see the questions are kind of gravitating towards two main topics. So I'll just list them both, and then happy to have the group address them organically. The first one is around regulations. So sustainable finance disclosure regulations that are coming up in the EU. Also, human rights and environmental due diligence law coming up in the EU. Japan is planning something similar, California, Germany. And the question being around, do you believe that that's actually going to drive any change, or is it just going to be more as usual? So that would be one. And the second being around the value of higher education in sustainable procurement. So how do you see the value that higher education can play? How far do you believe courses and certifications will add value to the job market for companies? And also something around how effective are NFPs training and educational curricula in return for the tax breaks? Is the standard high enough in order to drive the intervention need? So regulations and the value of education, those are the main topics.
A crack at the regulation. I think it's a huge and complicated topic. I think if you're relying on regulation to move things forwards, you're not really fully looking at the sustainability angle, because for me, sustainability is about anticipating the regulations and being ready, and when they arrive you say, well, we're already there. If you're reacting to regulation as it lands, that's compliance, which is a slightly different topic to me. So to my own students and clients, I try to say, look, this kind of regulation is coming in, this is how you prepare, this is how you make business sense of it, and when it arrives, you'll be compliant and you'll be ahead of your competitors. So there's an element of how you look at legislation. Is it effective? Some of it is, some of it isn't, and a lot of it is and again the way to react to that in the way I've kind of developed it is to actually try and work with regulators, because they often don't understand your industry and you do. And a lot of lobbying is about saying, oh, give us more time and less regulation, can we have a subsidy and so on. And I prefer to go to regulators and say, look, this is how our industry works. This is how it's wired. If it was wired like this, we could actually deliver more sustainable outcomes. So if you regulate here and here and here, you get what you want, we get what we want, and the world get what they want. So as an engineer by training, I'm looking at how can you design regulation that actually works to deliver all the outcomes in a problem-solving way, not in a traditional lobbying way, which says give us more time and less regulation. And there's equivalence. There's a false equivalence in many people's minds, especially in this country where I am in the UK. That all regulation is just bureaucracy that gets in the way. If it's good regulation, it should be helping, and it should be worth adhering to and worth engineering towards. So there's an element of shaping regulation. There's an element of not waiting for regulation and being proactive, and there's an element of doing regulation in order to create better outcomes overall, and taking all the richness that comes with that, and not just having this adversarial politics of more regulation, less regulation, and waiting for regulation to drive your business. If that's all you're doing, you're saying we just like being barely legal. We don't like doing anything more than regulation. And really sophisticated, competitive businesses should be thinking far beyond when regulation hits as to what kind of regulation needs to happen and how they can contribute positively. So it is, for me, it's a rich field and is thought of rather simplistically in public discourse.
I can't add a lot to that. So I mean, because I think the only thing I'd add on regulation from back to education aspect here is you do need to understand the regulations in the markets you're operating in and in the countries you're operating in. And I think I saw that in some of the chat, because it does vary, and it does vary quite a lot. And probably certainly one of the things I've advocated for people is choose the regulation that is the toughest and use that to apply to everything, because that way it's almost like national jurisdiction. So if you're in the UK and you believe that regulation is actually the most demanding of your organisation, your suppliers, then you can use that as the sort of to shine a light on the things that need to improve. But you do need to understand the regulation. I think you touched on that. I think Stephanie touched on it as well, just in terms of research. You've got to understand it and take it forward. I think the other question I think was built in there is probably is linked to the education piece. I mean, as we said, you can invest a lot in education, and Stephanie just sort of talked about the investment that she'd made herself and into investing in it. But there's a lot of information out there, so it's investing in time. Is a lot of the cases to learn and understand and to build up the skills that are needed, because there's a huge amount of knowledge and insight in there. We work with the aerospace sector, and there's a next generation group. We're doing something similar and looking at all the reports, looking at all the research, finding it all together. They learned a huge amount just by looking stuff that's in the public domain, and then they started to apply that in their own sector, in their own environment. So I think that if you're naturally curious, you will invest your time and effort in here. But it does need investment, and it does need that time and investment in here. So, but yeah, I think there's also some of the stuff about the chat is, are courses available and are there long lists available? Yeah, start Googling and you'll find them, and you'll find a lot more than you thought were ever available, I would have thought.
It gave me an idea from an SPP perspective, because we have a list, we have a technology list, and I'm thinking, well, actually, maybe we could develop a list also of the different trainings that are available. But that's a side topic from our main topic. There was a question more specifically for you, Duncan, from Tuan Kloot. She or he is asking, I am a procurement professional underway with a master's to make the shift to sustainable procurement and looking for work in sustainable procurement. I don't have a SIP certification, but would be interested if it addresses sustainability in procurement. I could imagine more people have the same considerations. How would SIPs benefit my sustainable procurement career, and how does the program keep up to date with industry developments? Thank you.
So there's probably two ways of answering that. I think, do SIPs have a sustainable certification, if you like, at the moment? No, we don't. We know that we need to, and actually we were in a meeting this morning talking quite specifically around what that is and what's needed to take it forward. And I'd argue, it's embedded in a lot of our certifications at the moment, but we don't have that standalone module that maybe people are looking for. So that'll come, and it'll come based on demand. We're getting more demand for it, and therefore we will develop that and take that forward as we go forward. So I think what I would say though is any education around good strategic procurement will help you to apply those insights into sustainability. One of the other topics often is sustainable procurement different from good procurement? No, it's the same thing. It's applying strategic thinking, it's applying that sense of what's really important to your organization, what's important to your supply chain, driving that change all the way through. And if you really think about strategic procurement properly, it's based on requirements. And if you get the requirements right, you drive that all the way down through your supply chain. So it is good practice procurement, and any education in really good strategic procurement, learning properly about how to apply that effectively, how to manage your supply chain effectively, you will drive sustainable procurement forward. So I think any investment in procurement will pay dividends for you in this space.
Thank you, Duncan. Are there any more questions in the chat? If people want to raise their hands and ask a question directly, that's also fine. Don't be shy. We're all very kind.
There's a couple, Sonia, around the value of this kind of education to your CV. Yes. and how it goes through higher education. And so also just to say a few words on that. I'm a great believer that sustainability shouldn't be done by the sustainability department either on its own or to everybody else. That it's something, if it's going to deliver what it is meant to deliver, it has to be pervasive throughout organizations and supply chains. So I like the idea of sustainable procurement because you're educating procurement people to do sustainability. I like the idea of sustainable finance as an education dynamic to get finance people thinking about it. So it needs to be pervasive rather than creating sustainability courses only for sustainability people. And I think what I sense, where I sit, in the past 3 years, I would say, I've seen a really big uptick in people asking for sustainability as a skill. So I don't think it does you any harm at all. And I think in the medium to long term, it really will improve your employability to know about these things, because it will be expected, you know, and to have a sophisticated understanding of this rather than just ticking a box saying, yeah, I know what carbon is or something, but actually being able to solve problems. So I don't think it does your career any harm to be educated in this this kind of space, and I think there's increasing demand and supply of education around there. And you know, having done this for a decade and a half, that's a really visible, palpable kind of change that's been going on. And you know, what role does it take? Is another question in here. Again, it should be embedded in all business courses for all disciplines, as far as I'm concerned. And you know, and we've tried to create courses which are, you know, as I say, sustainable finance, sustainable procurement, to encourage people not to become sustainability people, but to take it away and do it in their domain, so it actually spreads right across all functions and all supply chains. So yeah, there's a really big push there, and you know, it's one of the, there's lots to be a bit concerned about in this space, but the push in terms of supply and demand and people getting better education and applying it is something that I find has moved along refreshingly quickly over the past 2 or 3 years. In a sense, the pandemic has been a little bit of a help, because people might have had to take some career downtime, and they've taken time to educate themselves, and so I see a lot of people moving along in this space in a way that they might not have done otherwise.
Just one quick remark, and what you notice as well, to your point, Ian, is that if you look at the job market at the moment, there's so more and more companies who are publishing positions for a sustainable procurement expert, specialist, manager, I mean, at different levels of the organization. So absolutely, I think it's a great value add on your CV. Duncan, sorry, I cut you off a little bit.
You cover well. I've seen more and more so procurement leaders also been given responsibility for sustainability across the whole organization, because it's such a supply chain has such a great impact on sustainability for their organization that they're assuming those roles and taking those roles forward. So all I was going to say is, from a career development perspective, building those skills up, you know, people are looking for those advocates, those passionate people who will drive the agenda forward, not across the business as well as in the supply chain. And more of those roles are coming through. They're sort of the chief sustainability officer, but often those people are procurement people who understand how to drive the changes down through procurement and supply.
Yeah.
Sonia, can I add something else?
I
just wanted to finish off by saying that one of the other main benefits I found was the network of other passionate sustainability individuals that I worked with, and from different industries all over the world. I found that doing the course and the whole journey with them was actually really invaluable, and we've kept in touch, and we help each other out when there's questions that come up, and everyone's always willing to help and learn from each other. So I think that's been excellent as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Stefan. It's definitely an important element. We're coming towards the end of the hour. It's 58, and unfortunately I do need to free up that link for the next sessions that are about to start. So you each have 30 seconds for final words of wisdoms before we close down. If you want to, you don't have to.
I go, yeah, I mean, it's always worthwhile. It's, for me, it's a problem-solving thing. It's not an add-on thing, and it's fascinating intellectually and personally to look at the world in a different way. The courses that we do, it's very common to people to come along and do the courses and not just go away with extra information, but looking at life differently. Is actually quite profound, the changes that take place. And yeah, and that sounds like kind of, you know, overblowing it a bit, but that's actually a serious piece of observation over a number of years, that people get into this space and think, wow, I will never look at the world the same way again. And there's not many training spaces that can make that kind of claim. So it's exciting, it's interesting, it's problem solving, and it changes the way that you look at life. So yeah, that's why I do it, all of those reasons.
I agree. Duncan?
I think just get started, invest as you're doing today. If you're watching this and being part of this, invest your time and effort, get started, choose a topic that's of real interest to you and interest to your organization, and get started. And back to Ian's point, you'll start to open up opportunities, open up changes, influence society and influence the supply chain in a way you never thought you could. And once you start to do that, you start to get really passionate about it, and then you'll do more and you do more and you do more. So, you know, invest and get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie, Duncan, Ian, for having joined us, me today, and thank you to the audience as well. I think it was a very good session again. adding to the list of the excellent sessions we had earlier today. And I feel like we could have carried on for longer, but it's always the case. Unfortunately, we have to finish. Thank you so much for joining us again. And everything will be available on spp.earth, the website of the SPP, the recording. And if you want to share materials again, put them in the chat now before it closes. And well, speak to you soon at another training, maybe. Thank you, Duncan, Ian, Stephanie.